Ladies and gentlemen, hey, hi, how you doing? Welcome back to the channel. Thank you so much for stopping by. With the major Season 5 Reloaded update, we saw a pretty significant amount of weapon changes and meta updates, not just for Warzone, but surprisingly for multiplayer as well. The past couple of seasons, we really haven't seen all that many notes in the multiplayer category for weapon buffs or weapon nerfs, but we saw a lot of very unique ones here with Season 5 Reloaded. And with that said, today we are going through and adjusting the meta accordingly, seeing what the new best weapons are after this update. So as we get into it all, if you guys enjoy the video, do me a favor, drop a like on it, would be seriously appreciated. And if you are new to the channel, or if you haven't already, feel free to hit that subscribe button to guarantee you are always up to date with absolutely everything going on in COD, between news, updates, patch notes, meta breakdowns like this. I got you covered on a daily basis. But first things first, it's been a minute since we've looked at this list because there hasn't been a lot of weapon tuning going on, and we do have a couple of new weapons to go through and rank. Obviously, our two new ones from yesterday, and the M13C as well from the start of the Shadow Siege event. And the M13C, I mean, it's an all right sniper support rifle, but it's really nothing all that crazy. Its damage and its range and velocity, whatnot, compared to the other more aggressive AR SMG hybrid style guns is pretty lacking, you know, compared to the Advancer, compared to Chimera, 74U, etc. It's just not really getting the job done that well. The new Lockman Shroud, also a competitive SMG in my opinion. It on paper is absolutely nuts if you can hit the fire rate cap, but realistically you're not going to consistently hit that fire rate cap. Some players won't hit it ever, so it is great in theory. In execution though, it is decent for sure, but nothing crazy good. And then the new 9mm Damon, I mean, it is about as consistent as you'd want for a pistol, and it's right up there with the other ones. It's probably my favorite pistol right now, just because it's really satisfying to use. Up there with like the F-Tac Siege would be my top two choices. All the pistols outside of the Deagle and the automatic Deagle are pretty solid in multiplayer, just because the health is so low. You can use all these and do well, but the Damon, really fun to use, also brings some cool attachments to the game as well. But now, outside of the new weapons being introduced, like I said, we also got a bunch of unique weapon buffs and weapon nerfs for multiplayer specifically here that's completely different from what we saw in Warzone. And even now with this general breakdown, obviously this list is drastically different from what we have with our Warzone one, because multiplayer just plays so differently. So I've got my list of notes over here that we'll be referencing for all the changes, starting first with the F-Tac Siege, as we were just talking about. It got a close to mid-range buff, so it'll be a little bit more effective where it's going to be used the majority of the time, although it's still just a pistol, so when you're in that close to mid-range, it'll work just fine, and that's why it's competitive. But in reality, you know, if it's going up against a Vel or a Vaznev or even some of the faster rifles, it's probably going to lose just because it doesn't have the power of those options. Now, I won't lie, this one kind of came as a surprise to me. The ISO 45 actually got a range buff, which was not something I was expecting to see, because the ISO 45 was already fantastic in multiplayer, and it now being even better over range allows this to be even more versatile as a sub, and to me, does bump it up into that absolute meta area. I mean, this thing is very nice right now in general. It obviously is going to have a bunch of different builds that work well for any given playstyle. If you need an optic, throw that on. If you like the iron sights, you could use those. And close range and mid range, this thing's going to do really, really good in multiplayer. Now on the flip side, the Lockman sub, like the #2 SMG, right? It actually got a close range nerf, so it'll be slightly less effective in that close range damage area, which is unfortunate, but it wasn't anything crazy drastic. It's still going to be one of the fastest, most aggressive SMGs in the game. And if you're accurate with it, it's still going to kill incredibly quickly. So slight nerf, won't be as good as before, but still easily a top tier sub. Now the Advancer also got a couple of minor buffs here. They buffed the range a little bit, and then also the hip spread. That's nothing too crazy, but this and the Razorback are very similar in so many different ways now that I feel like each of them could be considered absolute meta. I mean, they are so good and so similar in their that first damage range and that second damage range and that general mid-range area where these weapons thrive. They are really close to one another. They also behave very similar, like their recoil patterns, their fire rate, everything like that. I mean, they work, they get the job done. Also, speaking of the Razorback, it got a range buff as well, so just further proving the point, this thing is nasty still. Now this next one, hold on to your horses, guys. The M16 got another buff. It's close to mid-range range got buffed. It's gonna be a little bit more effective there. It's still the M16, but technically it's gotten like 4 buffs in a row now, which in theory means the M16 is still better than ever after this update. But at the end of the day, it's still the M16, so like, it's not really all that great. It's competitive enough in MP because the TTK is so fast, right? But I wouldn't be using this over a lot of other options, especially the majority of the other rifles. Now, the 74U did actually catch a range nerf, and just because of the state of the mid-range rifles right now with the Chimera, Razorback, and Advancer all being so good, I feel like the 74U honestly is just more of a competitive rifle now. It's still a pretty solid choice, but it doesn't hold up against some of these other options, especially the Razorback and the Advancer. It does lack there in terms of overall aggressiveness, and now its range is going to be a bit worse as those were getting buffed, so it's definitely fallen behind a bit. Now, this one, again, I don't really know why it happened, but it did. The Hemlock got a mid to far range nerf, and the Hemlock was already decent in multiplayer just because, again, the low health, but wasn't anything all that great. And now when you compare it to the other rifles, again, it's just not really holding its own. I'd much rather take an M13 or an STB or a 7.62 over that at this point, so I wouldn't really consider them on the same level. Now, this is an interesting one. The TAC V actually got a range buff, and this thing is feeling very dominant in multiplayer right now. I wouldn't say it's absolute meta necessarily because it's a bit harder to control than some of these other options. It definitely takes a bit of getting used to, but its damage is nuts. It's one of my favorite weapons for multiplayer, so that's actually now a little bit better. The Squall also got a range buff, and I feel like this is probably worthy of being in the top tier area now. It's probably been overdue to go there for what it's worth, but after it was significantly nerfed when it was like the crazy broken weapon, it definitely was lacking some, but they've fixed it in some areas now to make it a bit more competitive, and when you extend that range, obviously it's a bit more efficient. SO14 got that same range buff. It's going to be staying in top tier, and then also the Lockman 7.62 got that same range buff as well. So all the battle rifles basically got buffed in the same way. They're all very, very strong, very solid. A little bit higher recoil weapons for the most part, but if you can master them, you're going to be rewarded nicely. Now, the shotguns also got some changes here. The Lockwood 300 got a mid-range nerf and a slug range buff, and that's going to be basically the same for every single shotty. So Bryson 890 got that same thing, and Bryson 800 got that same thing as well. I mean, in multiplayer, these things are nasty, but they're still going to be shotguns at the end of the day. If you miss one shot with these, you're probably going to get fried by an SMG or a rifle, so they're going to stay in competitive for me. The Lockwood is probably the closest to being on the lower end of this just because it's so limited in ammo, but if you land your shots, it's still going to be decent. Now, the MK2 got an ADS speed and an ADS speed movement buff, so it's just more aggressive now, but also in similar fashion to like the shotguns here, very unforgiving if you miss a shot. So while it is super fun to quickscope and probably the best like aggressive quickscope style weapon in the game, because it's so unforgiving, I don't feel like it really can ever peak outside of competitive. Now, for whatever reason, they also buffed the SAB, the SAB, which is insanely good for quickscoping and playing aggressive here with better ADS speed, movement speed, and a range buff now. It's going to be even better than it was before. Absolutely a top tier gun, and still one of the more annoying weapons to run into in the game because it's going to one-shot you up close and it's going to one-shot you at long range too. The thing is definitely solid. Another similar weapon, the SPR, it also got a slight range buff, so it'll just be able to be a bit more effective. Might have that extra one shot, you know, if you're at a longer range, which is nice to see. Just also another dominant sniper sort of marksman style weapon. Now, unfortunately, the EBR got a range nerf, which bums me out because I do really like the EBR. This one is probably borderline competitive at this point because it also has that slower fire rate, might be a bit more unforgiving than some of these other options like the Recon, the SO14, some of the other marksman and battle rifle style weapons. It's close there, but it also has so much damage and it can like two-shot at like any range that I feel like it also stays up here if you're just the least bit accurate. This is another one that I'm a fan of. The HCR actually got a mid-range buff, so it'll be more effective there, and I feel like it's probably deserving of jumping up in a top tier. It's a really low recoil gun, very easy to use, and even for an LMG, it really feels like more of an LMG and AR hybrid style gun. Also, while we're down here, I'm not sure why I have the RPK in competitive, but this is definitely a top tier LMG too. It's also AR LMG hybrid, just behind the 7.62. Now, the RAP ended up getting a mid-range buff as well. This is already one of my favorite guns in the game. Obviously super slow and super heavy, but if you just have your sights pre-aimed, no one stands a chance. You're gonna melt them, and now in that mid-range, it's even better. Now, the Carrick got some buffs. They buffed its close range, which is weird because that's not where you're using the Carrick sniper. It got an arm multiplier buff, a long range buff, and then also some movement buffs. So it's a more aggressive sniper now, but it's still the most awkward sniper out of the bunch in my opinion, and definitely lacks in comparison to the Signal, and then even also the bolt action ones as well. Speaking of bolt action, the Imperium ended up getting an ADS speed and an ADS movement buff, so it's a tad bit more aggressive now. You can build this out to be relatively good for quick scoping and whatnot, and it's solid obviously at a one shot. It's a very standard snipe. Now, the Signal got a close range nerf, but that seems like a pretty irrelevant nerf because you're not going to be using the Signal in close range. And then the last thing that we got is an SPX range nerf, so that'll be a little bit less effective over range, but with MP it's still super easy to go around and quick scope with this thing and land consistent one shots back to back to back. And I mean, as you can see with how multiplayer plays out, and because the health is so low, the TTK is so fast, So many different guns can excel here, whether they are low skill like the MX9, the M13, the Lockman 5.56 that are just point and shoot laser beams, or if they're higher skill like the SO14, the TAC V, you know, even some of the LMGs or snipes in some cases. You can thrive with so many different options here. Like, there are very few guns that are unusable in multiplayer, which I guess is good. Although personally, with that fast TTK, it also means that it's just going to be Fry City constantly. You know, you could run into so many different guns and just get melted, even if you have a better build and a more powerful gun, just because they get a slight jump on you because there's so little time to react. But I mean, it's a healthy meta, and that's an objective statement. And that being said, that's going to wrap things up for this one. If you enjoyed the video, do me a favor, drop a like on it. Would be really appreciated. And if you're new here, feel free to hit that subscribe button on your way out. But once again, thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, take it easy, have an awesome rest of your day, and I'll catch you guys later. Peace out.